Jinx. As one of the poster children of League of Legends and consistently one of the most popular champions in the role, Jinx is a staple champ for her mix of hypercarry DPS output and incredibly high range. With delicate positioning and the APM to back up her high-octane kit, Jinx players give themselves the opportunity to have the output to completely carry games. Hello and welcome to this Jinx guide. Here's a quick breakdown of how we'll be going over the video. I'll touch on general concepts of Jinx's purpose as a champion and of what success looks like in games that you are doing well on her. We'll then discuss different components of her kit and how we can work better to optimize each one of these. This includes going over different matchups, rune optimizations, ability maxing, your build, drafting, and how to play out each phase of the game. By the way, if you enjoyed this video, would really appreciate a like on it if it helped you out. Moving on. In terms of champion identity, Jinx is pretty much as standard front to back as they come. Her kit thrives at being able to be flexible and have separate strengths at separate ranges, thanks to her two main guns, Pow Pow and Fishbones. The rest of her kit, conveniently, is also a bunch of guns and various ranged weaponry to help aid her create space and still output damage from longer ranges. She's extremely snowbally and scales incredibly hard, naturally creating a target on her back for many teams to get rid of. This is a kit that is pretty hard to argue against for the most part when it comes to team compositions, so in times where Jinx is good, she will be an absolutely staple pick in both solo queue and competitive play. You'll often see her get blinded as early as in the B1 slot, as she tends to gravitate the game around her hypercarry potential. When it comes to the draft at that point, the dynamic of the draft then shifts to thinking about the best ways to counter the Jinx, as well as the team that picked her finding tools to answer. Teams picking her may opt for overall good front-to-back comps that give her a lot of space to operate and just melt enemy teams, where enemy teams may be incentivized to either punish her with dive comps that can delete the Jinx, outrange with poke, or even match the front to back with a comp that has different strengths instead. In exchange for the amazing output that Jinx can bring to the table, she trades this for both an insanely low level of mobility and overall survivability. When Jinx gets fed, times are really good, but if Jinx gets behind by even a couple of deaths in the early game, she starts to become completely useless, and you definitely feel it. So if either teams pick comps that can able to highlight Jinx's weaknesses, or if Jinx herself fails to perform in the early game, it can completely shut this champion down. Go ahead and jump into Jinx's kit. At face level, each of her abilities are relatively simple. The skill expression for Jinx in this case comes from getting very familiar with the use cases and situations in which we should deploy each of her guns. Let's break it down. Starting with Jinx's passive ability, Get Excited. This grants her a significant boost in movement speed and attack speed whenever she scores a kill or assist. The movement speed increase allows her to quickly chase down enemies or make a quick escape after getting a kill. The effect lasts for several seconds and can stack, meaning that Jinx can continue to gain movement speed with each kill or assist. The passive is what makes Jinx such a potent hypercarry in the late game, because getting just one kill turns her into an absolute teamfight menace, and there is no chance for the enemy team to get away from her at that point. This also procs off of towers and neutral objectives, so you can sometimes get away with stealing objectives and then using that movement speed to either run away or even build tempo to start a fight. Jinx's Q ability, Switcheroo, allows her to switch between her minigun and her rocket launcher. Pow Pow, her minigun, gives an insane ramping attack speed steroid, giving her half of the total buff on the first of 3 autos and the other half split across the subsequent 2 autos. Her rocket launcher, Fishbones, has a 10% attack speed penalty but deals increased splash damage to multiple targets at the exchange of mana per auto attack. This also converts the bolts from Rune's Hurricane into these rockets, so it's a very strong power spike for her. There is a soft auto reset combo here when Jinx switches from Pow Pow to Fishbones, as her first auto carries over the attack speed bonus from Pow Pow with no penalty. The main rule of thumb with the two guns is to just adjust to the gun you need based on your safe DPS range. If possible, it's optimal to build your minigun stacks before having to rely on Fishbones' extended range, but especially in late game teamfights, you'll find that it's the main way you'll be dealing any damage at all. In lane, you want to actively switch between the two. Fishbones will be your main harass tool as an ability that gives you range advantage pretty much permanently in the laning phase. Paired with Presence of Mind that gives you almost a full refund on the mana cost in lane, this is the main way that Jinx can stabilize and provide pressure in the early phases. Once this ability hits rank 5, this is when Jinx really starts to ramp up and extract a huge amount of value, since the multiplicative effects of her attack speed steroid combine with her item spikes here to create a nasty combo. Jinx's W ability Zap is a single target long range skill shot that deals damage and slows slows the first enemy hit. The slow effect is actually particularly potent here, making this a great ability for poking enemies from a safe distance or setting up kills for yourself or your teammates. Use it to still output DPS when walking up to auto attack feels dangerous, or to potentially chase down enemies that are farther out. The cast time of Zap also goes down significantly with Jinx's attack speed, by the way. The most important immediate application for this is of course with the bonus on Pow Pow, which pretty much cuts this cast time by 40 to 50%. You can also use Zap as a kill confirm for Jinx's ultimate, which we'll talk about later, because the slow also allows you to set up for other skill shots. Jinx's E ability, Flame Chompers, sets a trap on the ground that roots enemies who step on it. The traps can be placed in strategic locations to control the battlefield and prevent enemies from escaping or pursuing. The traps also deal damage when they explode, making them a useful tool for finishing off low health enemies or zoning enemies away from objectives. However, the traps take a moment to arm, so it's important to time them correctly. The traps also disjoint dashes. Use them in key areas to force enemies to go around. This works especially well in chokes, where it would effectively cut an entire path out. Jinx's ultimate ability, Super Mega Death Rocket, fires a giant rocket that deals damage to all enemies hit. As it travels, its damage increases from 10% to 100%. A big tip here is that the distance required for Jinx's ultimate to hit this max damage threshold is the exact same as her W, which is 1500 units. If it's possible in lane or team fights, you should generally try to use it off of CC lockdowns, as they are essentially kill confirms for your ulti to deal damage. Most of its damage also comes as an execute, so you should generally use it as a final blow type of ability. This execute damage also works really well on objectives, so feel free to prop it in an attempt to steal them. Be liberal with this ability. The cooldown is very short for what it is, so any chance you get in order to get value from it is a chance you should take. Let's quickly touch on Jinx's runes, since I would consider it pretty clear cut for her. Jinx almost always wants to take a Lethal Temple Keystone since it works so well with her overall playstyle, and it's pretty much best in slots for not only Jinx, but many AD carries. To follow up with this, take Presence of Mind, Legend Bloodline, and either cut down for Tank Shred or Coup de Grace otherwise. For your secondary tree, I'd say you have a few options depending on the game, and more importantly, your laning phase. If you want just one tree that you can consistently go every game, I can recommend going Inspiration, taking Free As Boots, and Biscuit, just for as consistent of an early game as possible. In slow lanes where you're not going to have a lot of threat, Absolute Focus and Gathering Storm is a good page just to access a pretty high amount of AD. Some less common pages that are also very viable are actually Domination or even Resolve in some cases. In your Domination secondary, you could take Taste of Blood and Treasure Hunter to provide a more aggressive version of the Inspiration page. Resolve gives you a varying defensive strengths as well, which is especially helpful because Jinx pretty much can't itemize defensively. Second Wind works really well against lanes with a lot of poke, especially so against a Twitch matchup, and Conditioning gives you a great boost in resistances where you otherwise are just not able to purchase it. Overgrowth pairs well with this to increase Jinx's survivability as well. One last one is if you need to take Cleanse, you can actually go Inspiration and go for Cosmic Insight in order to reduce the cooldown of Cleanse so you can have it up more often and reduce the need to buy QSS. Feel free to play around with different secondary trees, as the best tree in each game will surely depend on the game and the situation. For your adaptive runes, you're pretty much set with attack speed, adaptive force, and armor. Let's touch on items. Over the years, I've seen a few variations of Jinx builds and orders come in and out of viability. So while I'll recommend a few combos, you should look these up on item build websites to ensure that you have the most up-to-date ones available. For mythics, there are honestly situations where all three core AD carry mythics can come into play. For the most output and the most synergy with her natural DPS style, many Jinx players do prefer Kraken Slayer though. This is also by far the best for Tank Shred. If the enemy team has many squishy champions, you can generally get away with Gale Force instead. After this, you're typically picking up IE and then branching off into whatever crit items you need at that point. For your first two items, there's also an alternate path that allows you to wait and hedge your mythic choice for later on. This revolves around getting Bloodthirster and IE/LDR as your first two items, then going for your mythic item third. This build is usually necessitated when you're facing against enemy comps that have a lot of kill threat, in which the bonus shield from BT actually serves a really great purpose in increasing your survivability. This is usually enough to push Jinx from being decently strong to actually being decently hard to deal with. With this build, you basically can choose any of the three mythics you want, and you can just tech your pick based on whichever one suits the situation best. Most people are going to enjoy Kraken Slayer still, since it is her best mythic by far in terms of output. The mobility from Gale Force works well into squishier teams as well. If there's undodgeable or engage or anything that just necessitates higher level of survivability, Shield Bow is a less common but decently viable take into scenarios where you just need raw defensive stats against undodgeable engage. The only downside with this version is that it increases your reliance on shields, meaning that you would be weak against items like Serpent's Fang or Shadow Flame. After your core, you've got a few options in terms of what to branch off into, but it's generally going to be focused on continuing to increase your output. Items like Runons, like I mentioned, are going to be great for increasing your damage against multi-target, heavy front-to-back scenarios. Phantom Dancer makes for a great single-target version of this since Jinx benefits well from the increased movement speed. LDR is of course a great take into tank-heavy teams and should be taken as early as second to replace another item in cases where you feel a huge health delta between you and your opponents. For boots, Berserker Greaves are pretty much always going to be best in slot here and should be built into tier 2s after your first item. Once you hit 3 items, you've basically got most of the output you need, and Jinx can start building defensively if you need it. Most of the time, you don't even want to be hit in fights in the first place, so most Jinx players will simply continue to build more damage. If you do need defensive capability, I'd say the main item you could get around 4th item or beyond is Guardian Angel, in which the res can be absolutely clutch in certain scenarios. Otherwise, feel free to build any mix of the previously mentioned items above. In the early game, your goal as Jinx is to farm as much gold as possible and avoid dying. Jinx is relatively weak in the early game, so it's important to play safe in laning phase and avoid trading with the enemy laner unless you have a clear advantage. By far, Jinx's main advantage in early is creating a range advantage with Fishbones, which you can often get uncontested autos on enemies, similar to how Caitlyn sort of does the same. She can synergize with both enchanters and engaged champions, which influences how she plays out her laning phase. With enchanters, her focus is more on survival and giving herself time to scale, and with engaged champions, this turns into a much more aggressive style, leveraging her lane partner's lockdown capabilities in order to get out free DPS and hit her key abilities. Jinx's kit allows her to be flexible and thrive in both scenarios, so the key to adapting your lane phase is about knowing the matchup of both bot lanes together to see what seems optimal and assessing based on overall kill threat and lane conditions. If you are threatened in lane but outscale, your objective of course becomes to play around chilling in lane and not trading heavily, whereas if you have the aggressive support on your side, then you have leverage in playing more aggressive. Teamfighting is where Jinx really starts to come online, and is really the crux of her champion identity. Her goal is relatively simple too, and as long as she gets to survive and hit the enemy front, she's going to pretty much get away with a free team fight most of the time. This is thanks to her ridiculous damage output and range, allowing her to absolutely fly around team fights. The key here lies in your AD carry fundamentals. Jinx is very immobile, and almost any good team is going to focus on punishing you if they want to stop your win condition. Keep in mind the enemy's range in these scenarios, especially their engage range, and then adapt accordingly. Overall, Jinx is an absolute staple in the AD carry role for a multitude of reasons. She brings a great amount of output to the table, brings a ton of carry potential, and it's hella fun. Hope this guide was insightful to you guys, and I will see you in the next one. Stay fresh.